Okay.
A bit about your childhood.
I was born in 1956 on May Eve, which was a great night to be born because it's in Celtic mythology, the 1st of May is Beltane, which is a huge festival. So the eve before the festival is the night when all the celebrations happen. So right through my childhood, there are huge bonfires everywhere. It's like bigger than Guy Fawkes in the UK or the 4th of July in the US. And I thought they were for me. Didn't realize it was a festival that wasn't for my birthday. So yeah, that was cool.
This was in Ireland.
Yeah, so I grew up in Limerick, but on the very edge of the city, on the edge of the Shannon River. My parents' house literally goes, the other side of the street is the Shannon River, which is the largest river in the British Isles. And it's a particularly beautiful bit of it with lots of swans and islands. And so I grew up in the water a lot. Like all our summers were spent with punts that people had made, and then we swam all the time with eels and pike, and lots of catching fish. And it was a bit like swallows and Amazons. I mean, I don't think I realized until later how much freedom we had. We were never called in unless we were starving hungry, and then we came home for tea. And school really was a necessary evil which you had to put up with until you got out to play. And I only had brothers, I had no sisters, so I was a terrible tomboy.
How many brothers?
Two, but I was the oldest, so I was like, we're really close in age. One is 2 years younger and the other's 3 years younger, so we were very similar. I had an older sister who died 2 weeks after I was born, which I think was very hard for my parents, but I didn't really get it at all until I was much, much older. And the so the other side of that was I was brought up with a great sense of freedom. The other side of it was very 1960s and 70s Catholic Ireland. So they were quite strict adherents to particularly girls about what it was okay for you to do and how you were expected to behave and what you were supposed to look like, and decorum and demeanor and manners, and it was really hard for a girl who was automatically a tomboy that wanted to be playing by the river. So I didn't find puberty very easy at all. It was a real, like, it wasn't that different, I suppose, to Muslim culture in that we had to wear mantillas, and we had to wear little gloves, and we had to, like, our skirts always had to be below our knees. Uh, and it's interesting because I've ended up working a lot with small businesses, and my mum's family were farmers going back generations, self-made. My granddad had gone off to the Yukon and found gold and come back and bought a farm in the Silvermine Mountains and married a convent girl and had 12 children. And then my dad's family, my grandmother is Lithuanian Jewish, so they'd fled the pogroms in Russia at the time, end of the 1890, and then come across to Ireland, and they were tailors. So very common tailors, jewelers, people that crafted stuff with their hands. So both sides of my background, ancestry, are all small businesses, and they're all very individualistic and very self-made and very kind of like they sort of thrived on the American ideal of you are what you do, and nobody has a right to tell you what to do. You just make things possible. It was really interesting. So it was an odd background because on the one hand it was hugely physically free because I was brought up in nature, and quite feral is the word I use now when I look at how uncontrolled we were allowed to be. Like how we didn't die is a miracle when you think of the escapades we got up to. But the other side of it was how rigid the rules were, and how the expectation loaded on the children was that they were going to do well. They were going to be well off. They were going to progress. And there was no question that if you had any kind of brain or aptitude at all, that you would be a self-made person. There was very little recognition of society's role in anything. It was like you are what you do. And yeah, so it was an interesting mix for me when I got to the 1974, I left school. But the late 60s, early 70s was when the Troubles kicked off in Northern Ireland. So there was all that social justice violence stuff. And then the American women's liberation, freedom from rules, anti-establishment towards the churches. So it was like I do sometimes feel like I was born in this whirlpool of different influences, like not really without. When I look back and I think of how naive I was sent away to boarding school for secondary school, which is not unusual in Ireland. If you're from a semi-prosperous family, it's not like in the UK where you have to be more well off, I think, to go to private school. There it was like the church would look after you better than the family. So, but literally we went to mass every morning. We were, very rigidly controlled. So I think when I left school at 18, I was very unprepared for the world. I think we were kind of put away. So I loved art and poetry and languages, and it was just a bit out of this world.
Did that religious experience early on with the restrictions, did that skew your view on religion?
It made me so that when I fell foul of their rules, so they disapproved highly of the way I became when I was 18 or 19, which is
your family.
Yeah, my family and my faith community, if you like, who had been important up until then. I mean, I just rebelled against them. So I slept with my boyfriend, drank a lot, smoked spliffs, generally was like, I'm not going to be a good girl. You either were very good or you weren't. And I just didn't want to be.
You wanted to rebel against it?
Yeah, it didn't make any sense. It just didn't, it had stopped being logical. I wanted it to, if people were that kind towards each other, why did they judge so badly people who were poorer, for example? And you were sort of judged for poverty, like it was your own responsibility to get out of it. A bit like some of the politicians now that treat people like, well, there's no reason to be poor, you just need to be more ambitious, or you need to not eat junk food, you need to, like, as if there's no social fabric at all. And I didn't like the hypocrisy. It was very hypocritical. It was about appearance. It's about if you looked good and you behaved well, you could have a violent parent at home, or you could have a priest who fiddled with young boys. I mean, I never came across any of that, so I'm not saying this is personal experience. All I'm saying is you knew there was an undercurrent that wasn't okay, but it would never, ever be talked about. So it was that sense, what it's like when you're an adolescent. You're really concerned with justice. You want things to seem fair, and it just didn't seem. People weren't living the talk. They weren't walking the talk. They were talking a lot in a sanctimonious way.
Do you practice today?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I'm heavily involved in the church. I've been a reader at the cathedral for years. I've run confirmation and communion classes. I brought all my kids up as Catholic kids. Yeah, it's really odd because from 18 on, I didn't go near a church for years. And then about 28 years old, I had children quite young. I had, my daughter is 40 this year, so I had her at 26 and my 25. And then my son I had him at 29, and then my other daughter I had when I was 42. I had quite a big gap. But because I had children, having children made me go back to the church. And also I had a son who died in between my daughter and my son. And up until that point, I didn't realize how much ritual mattered to me. And when it came to burying him, without a church, there was nothing. There was just nothing, like absolutely nothing. And suddenly all these things fell into place. And I thought the really big stuff, like how you die and how you live a moral life and what you teach your children, I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think the bathwater is pretty mucky. I'm not a great fan of men in frocks. I'm not a great fan of disenfranchising the role of women. I'm not a great fan of, separating the way we treat the planet and the way we treat justice towards those who are poor and the way we treat I'm not a great fan of a particular type of religiosity, but the spirit behind it, which is don't harm others, think of what you can contribute, not about what you can take. Live simply so that others may simply live, which is a motto from the Green Christians. I really believe in all that. So if you can strip away the the crust of crap, I think there's a gem in the middle of it that I would absolutely hold on to. It's a kind of a recognition that we're spiritual beings as well as biological and intellectual beings. And if you take one away altogether and ignore it, I think it comes back and bites you as an individual, but also us as a society. I think it's responsible for a lot of addiction. I think it's responsible for a lot of alienation and mental health issues where you don't feel connected to others. And faith really deep down is saying we're all one. The word religion actually means connection. It's the same word as ligament that links your bones and your muscles. It's the thing that makes us so that we're not, like quantum mechanics and quantum physics and all that, is discovering that there's no gap between one type of matter and another. It's all connected. And I really like that. It's kind of the participles and all the, the scientists who are often not godly are actually the ones discovering that it made perfect sense years ago when our ancestors, adored stars and things, because we're made of stars, we're made of carbon, and so. And I also think there's a point in human evolution that that we're approaching now, kind of existentially, because if we don't sort something out, we're going to destroy ourselves and the world we live in. And I absolutely fundamentally believe that you either step up and kind of evolve or you die. And humans have been around for 300,000 years, and they've been living a certain way for 30,000 years, and then they'll be living another way for 12,000 years, and without going into the long history of it. But the Industrial Revolution is only a couple of hundred years old. But the acceleration of everything is like, if you look at any other species on the planet, what they do is they adapt to their environment. And our environment is radically shifting. So we either adapt or what? We consume even more stuff. It doesn't seem like a really good way to spend a life. So yeah, so I think I threw out the foundation upon which I was born in my early 20s out of ignorance and out of abhorrence for the bits I didn't like. But then I realized by living longer and suffering tragedies and getting a different perspective that you really need to take all of it. That's why I'm a very Rumi kind of person, the Persian poet that wrote, "Beyond right and wrong, there is a garden, I will meet you there." Like as soon as you start dividing everything up into this is okay, this is not okay, this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong, I think you're already in the problem, because the solution is it's all okay.
How do you see a connection between your beliefs now and other ways of believing, other religions, or what are your views on?
I think the great faith traditions and the indigenous traditions that never became faiths, for example, the big monotheistic ones, are like a tapestry of inspiration that you can draw off every strand. I mean, I actually took time out a few years ago to go to Dublin and spend nearly 2 years doing a master's in applied spirituality. So I studied this stuff academically as well as living it through meditation or through prayerful practice or through going on retreats or through whatever, however it manifests itself in my life, daily ritual. But that was interesting in the awareness of how many gifts come through different strands. And also, I think people are quite ignorant about how interrelated all the faiths are. But it was a guy that once a taxi driver was driving me to Mass at the cathedral in St. Mary's, and he was Muslim, and his taxi had not the names of all the prophets across the top of the front windscreen, and it was like Abraham and Moses and David and Daniel and da 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 da. And I go, I know all them. Like and Judaism, of course, is so it's like a continuum. It's not a schism where people. Why are you arguing with these people when they all believe there's something more than our current consciousness knows how to process? But that's really all we're saying. Beyond humans' capacity to currently understand is something greater. Whether you see it as I quite like the Muslim things about not turning it into figures who look like people, because they're always, the old man with the beard in the sky and Jesus looking very pale and white skinned. Like, none of that ever seemed to me. I understand our desire to humanize things, and I understand the Christian belief in, at a particular moment in time, something extraordinary happened, where something eternal pierced the practical of human history. So but I don't properly understand. I mean, I don't think many people do, but you can live with the idea that that's what we're all being asked to become. The capacity to heal others by simply being with them. I've seen people able to do that. I mean, I've seen people heal people by simply the way they are in the world, the way they stand in the world, usually unimportant people. I mean, we're there's much more interesting things going on than it would appear. Don't read mainstream media ever about anything, because everything really important happening isn't reported. It's like, underneath the canopy of the trees that you see is all the ecology and all the stuff under the soil and all the, it's much more interesting.
Would it be fair to say then that your view on religion is that it's a way to deal with life, like the tragedies you experience, versus trying to find kind of an ultimate truth?
I think as a way for humans to stay sane and harmonious in their relationships with their own psyche and others, it provides very robust parameters and tools to support you to do that. So I think it boundaries our potential for craziness or selfishness or whatever. So in that sense, yes. But I'd also be a bit nervous, because I think it calls out of us to be more than those boundaries, which is why I used to think the word religion stood for a book of rules, because it's very similar to the Latin for the words for rule book. And actually that's what I think religion should not be. I think I'm not saying rules don't matter at all, but I'm saying to treat them like a straitjacket, that as long as you obey. I'm not a fan of obedience, if I'm honest. I think there's a time for obedience, which is when you're in a very steady state way of living. I think all sentient beings respond to the environment that they're born into. And right now I feel like the Frodo and Gandalf quote from Lord of the Rings he goes to Gandalf, I wish I wasn't born in these times. And Gandalf says, you don't get a choice as to what times you're born into. You simply get a choice as to how you choose to respond. And I don't think the life I've lived in, and that was only from the 50s till, who knows, maybe the 50s, maybe sooner, I have no idea. But you know what I mean? I don't think that span is as rocky as the span that's coming now. So I think the role of people like me, who I'm beginning to class myself as an elder, and quite a wise elder, I have learned a lot, is to hold some ground for what's coming. And sometimes it means you actually skip a generation. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean the people in the middle are so busy earning a living and so busy raising families and having mortgages and getting stressed, that somehow the youngers and the elders have got some baton passing opportunity. I notice it when I'm talking to people who are not yet locked in to they're just a minute. So they're not yet like, what do we have? We have time and place. You have to ration your time. A lovely guy I knew once told me he defined life as the choreography of energy. I think it's a quote from someone, but I don't know who. But I like that idea. John O'Donoghue talks about it a lot as well. I want to live like a river flows, surprised by the joy of my own unfolding. So you need to have enough fluidity and flow so that your whole day and time and energy isn't taken up with your to-do list and your responsibilities and do you know what I mean? There has to be that capacity. And that's very much where I'm living now, which is if I use my faith and beliefs, which although I am a Roman Catholic woman who has remained within the church, and I'm a great fan of the current Pope, I'm also very wary of some of their past crimes. So I'm not a defender of them in the sense of like the American obsession with abortion. It's just like, come on, guys. Like just single issue things that then distort everything else. I've no time for. It's so unnuanced, and it's not natural to be so rigid. It's not. Yeah, just.
Not very intellectual.
It's there's no heart in it. It's like I'm attached to an idea, and nothing is ever going to move me from that idea. Well, it means they're not reading scriptures at all. They're not reading wisdom writings, because that's not what it tells you. It tells you the reed that bends lasts a lot longer than the reed that's rigid. It breaks. So they're kind of like, what? Read the books. It's irrational, and it doesn't call the heart out of people. You have to put your heart in on the line. You can't just. I think we've over depended on rationality since the Enlightenment, in a way. I have started to work with something called systemic constellations, which is a form of. It's a therapeutic practice originally, but it came out of the fact that we need to go back to trusting our bodies, which is what old faith communities, particularly in indigenous periods and early biblical times in all our faiths, and Buddhists and all that did. They would go into a state where their body resonated and they knew what was healthy and what wasn't healthy. Much more useful phrases than right and wrong. So in other words, the rule book doesn't come from outside you, but you're absolutely clear by tuning in to what is actually correct for you and your body, because you feel tension in your shoulders, or you get churning in your stomach, or your throat constricts. All humans know when something is out of kilter or out of harmony or and so to me, religion is that beacon where you are tuned into something greater than yourself, and you respond to it with no doubts, because you couldn't do anything else. It's not like, oh, is this okay? Like, that question is irrelevant. You're just being who you're born to be, and everyone has their own born to be's, and what right do I have to dictate what yours is? I just trust you to be a person who's also checking that it's not false, that it's not led by, our marvelous egos or good. Somebody once told me, if you want to achieve anything great, particularly if you have what do we all want? We want a peaceful and harmonious world. I mean, and people, I think the human species is far more full of compassion and care than it is full of competition and aggression and violence. I don't believe that that's our natural state. The first few months of COVID was really interesting when you looked at how people behaved towards one another when there was an actual crisis. It was mainly kindness. It was mainly checking on your neighbours. It was mainly clapping the NHS. It was like, there is no reason at all to think we're programmed to want to defeat each other. It's just not, we have that in us, but it's not the boss. And some competition's fun. I'm a small business person after all. But you know what I mean? It's not, there's some time for us to step up, to see that the way we have in the main been thinking, which is very head-based and very dehumanizing, almost like you can just be an efficient human machine, is not enough. And so I don't mind what the issue is. I don't mind if it's genetic things, or I don't mind if it's biosynthesis, or I don't mind if it's, I don't know, any issue you can possibly think of. The context should be, how are we as humans? How is this making us feel as humans? And that if you call religion the word that encompasses the highest part of all of us, then that's the tuning fork we should be using to make decisions.
That's very interesting. You want to see Royal Class?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, going to go back a little bit to your childhood. What do you remember about your parents when you were a kid? Were they fairly strict in your upbringing? Fairly liberal? Did they encourage you to kind of rebel, or?
I might want. How free I am in answering is partly depends on how. I don't want to hurt people in my family by saying anything that they might find upsetting. So, my mom was like the model of a perfect Irish housewife. She never worked. She had no ambition other than to look after her husband and her children. She was very passive. She didn't argue. She didn't have strong opinions of her own. She was like the role model of how to be, as well as being attractive and kind and lovely. Like, she genuinely was a very big-hearted woman. But she could never see a reason for why people wouldn't obey the authorities or obey anyone. Like, women obeyed their husbands, men obeyed their bosses at work, parishioners obeyed their priests. I mean, to her, the world was so perfectly structured that anyone who wasn't like that was outside of her range of being able to understand. So she was definitely not the one who would force you to do things with any sense of force, but the distaste or the shame that would be poured over your head if you were tried to be different was actually, I think, worse sometimes than getting yelled at, because it was so, how could you do this to me? Whereas my dad was very different, very, very different, much more, the inspiration behind the development of his parents' business into a much bigger company. So he had left school at 13. Neither my mum nor my dad, when I think, were educated past 16. So they'd worked from being really young. My dad had, he was an amazing man. He was talented in music, so he could play any instrument. He could listen to a song on the radio, go into the living room, sit down at the piano and play it perfectly, note perfect. It's a real gift. We were all gutted because we had to learn music for years and years and years, every instrument you can imagine, and none of us inherited it. But just really naturally talented in almost everything. Was great at making clothes, great at making music, great at making friends, really extrovert. Came over to Cambridge and Oxford and did short courses in business management. Very inspiring guy, but he was also a raging alcoholic, and so were all of his brothers. I think it was how they dealt with the pressure they were under. They lived through the war, all of them. They were born in the 20s. They were 39, I think. And I think my dad was a teenager when the Second World War was on. Now, Ireland might have remained technically neutral, but that wasn't quite true, because all of their mates, loads of them, came over and joined the British Army and fought. Or they had all these kind of like the Home Guard type duties. So his duty was to drive up and down the west coast of Ireland on a motorbike looking for German submarines, and picking up girls, from what I can gather. But you know what I mean? It was a very, he was like the epitome of what a guy should be like, and she was the epitome of what a woman should be like. So it was very gender role driven, and I was very close and very similar to my dad. So it was a bit hard, because I had exactly the same passion as he had for music and for clothes. Like, I started working in the factory, I think, when I was only about 9, and they tried to get me to make clothes, and I was so bad at it that they put me in the accounts department, because I was really quick with numbers. Which I think is why I ended up in small business, because I picked up things to do with how systems operated quite quickly. Whereas when it came to actually making stuff with my hands, I was rubbish. I'm still rubbish. And it was a real skill that I wanted, but I was no good at it. And don't talk to me about housekeeping. I'm just not great. I mean, I'll do it because I have to, but you know, it doesn't give me a huge pleasure. So I think there was something about the way things played out that was like a caricature of what a male and a female were like, or a caricature of what a father and a mother were like. And the boys loved their mammy and I loved my daddy. And it was just very kind of, I remember years later looking at, you study in psychology this thing about male and female, what do they call it, archetypes, and how we usually as humans have an overdeveloped one or the other. So we're, you know, if you, I'm not using them as gender stereotypes. Not all males are feminine and not all women are, sorry, not all males are masculine, not all women are feminine. I don't mean them attached to your gender. I've no problem with gender fluidity, but there's something about them being, one is active and out in the world and the other is passive and receiving in the world. And when you talk about religion, I think we have an overdeveloped sense of the active external and an underdeveloped sense of the passive internal, you know, the reflection side and the getting in tune with your own inner heart and soul side and all that. So I over-identified with the masculine father figure. So the result of my upbringing was that when I was 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, I was so aggressively ambitious. And I was going to get top marks in exams. I came to London and went to work in oil and shipping and just, you know, I was going to go on the board of companies and I was like a little machine programmed to do well. And it took me quite a long time, well, not a long time, a young woman in your 20s, maybe 5 or 6 years, to realize I was absolutely miserable. Like, I hated it. I mean, it looked good from the outside. You know, I looked like an aerostess, little shoulders and spiky shoes and, you know, something out of Dynasty or just lots of makeup. But it was just, I was miserable. I was like, this isn't, like, if I'm doing everything right, why, like, surely the reward should be the feeling of rightness. You know, at least during the 50s and 60s and 70s, we genuinely believed that the more corporations were successful, the more the world would progress. Therefore, less people would be hungry, there would be more material wealth, which would flow over everyone. I mean, there was a real faith in the economics in a way that now when we're looking at degrowth and consuming less, and it's all become like very shuddery. But then there was no doubt, so there was like the capacity to align your own personal goals with society's goals was just perfect. And I was the right fit for it. So it was like life was going to be great. Like, why would you want to settle down and get married? You can do all these things. Only then I fell in love and got pregnant, and yeah, just. But also, I didn't enjoy the work. I mean, long before oil and fossil fuels became an issue, you know, I did work with Nigerian Petroleum, NPPC, what's it called? Anyway, the people that worked with Shell, and part of their thing was the destruction of Lagos, which is a part of Nigeria with serious pollution and villagers, and somebody got killed. And, you know, I worked with South Africa and apartheid was still going on. You just began to get a sense of this is not okay. And I worked for a shipping company during one of the big famines in Africa. I think it was Biafra or Nigeria. Anyway, they brought ships filled with grain over to Africa from the States. And there was a huge load of press about the Americans are motoring in to save all these poor, starving, whatever, developing countries. And by the time the grain landed in the ports, because I knew the captains on the ships, it was rotten. But nobody was reporting that bit. They were only reporting the press. So it just began, the whole system just felt to me a bit rotten. And if you see it close up, and you see all the backhanders and all the bribes and all the, you know, you just go, this is not what it was supposed to be like. It was supposed to be genuinely beneficial. So that was a bit of a shock to see like it from the inside and go. And also the way they treated women in the 80s in business was shocking. Like all that Me Too stuff, like every single person that made an announcement, you were able to go, yeah, I remember that. I mean, it was horrendous. So it just, I think multiple things happened where you thought, this is not what I thought it was. Yeah, there's something about ethics and morality when it comes to where humans decide to put their one, was it Mary Oliver calls it our one wild life. You get more discerning over time, the more you discover about people. And then you choose who you give your energy to. Because if you do have only one life, you don't want it to be simply for no purpose. And amassing wealth for myself never seemed to me a purpose that was worth much at all. Now, maybe if I had been my grandparents' age, that would have been different. Because they had both started with absolutely nothing. I mean, the farming family had come through the famine. My great grandparents lived through the famine in Ireland. So, and my other paternal grandparents had fled their homeland. So, when I watched the Fiddler on the Roof, the thing, I always go, oh, that was my ancestors. So, both came from nothing and built something. Then I think I completely understand the need to keep amassing things because you never completely feel secure. But I was third generation from that. I was the grandchild of that. So by the time it got to me, I took it for granted. I didn't grow up struggling to eat. I didn't grow up I wasn't hugely privileged, but I was definitely privileged. There was no insecurity. Although my dad did go bust when I was 17, so that was quite insecure. But it wasn't like even that, because we were so resilient, he just started something else the following year. It's made me so that my life has gone from periods when I was very well off to periods when I was really stuck for money. They didn't really make that much difference because I never expect either of them to last. And I didn't realize until years later that's quite unusual. Like if I'd come through I don't know, like my parents had always worked for a national charity or teachers or something. The thought of not having security is much more scary. That was a gift to me. A bit like the conversation about the guy losing his sight. Sometimes the worst things that can happen to you turn out to be the gift you need. Like I have had one or two very poor relationships in my life, and I've had a child that has struggled with mental health issues quite seriously. And I always think they were the periods where I was transformed the most. Or death of a child. I mean, who wants to live through that? But it turns you into somebody so much more sensitive to sorrow. And I almost think that sensitivity to sorrow is what makes us truly human. That's why being funnily enough, a Catholic, if you look at it the wrong way, they're obsessed with sorrow. Their symbol is somebody dying in a most horrible way. But there's something absolutely magic in it about transformation. And that's the thing that just keeps regenerating over and over again, like one season after another. It just makes you so joyful because nobody can take it away. It's not linked in the slightest bit to your external circumstances or whether the economy is doing this or whether it's got no, it shines from inside of you. Like it doesn't, nobody can steal it. No circumstance can rob that feeling. And that's what I like about this constellation type thing is the sense that you can do that collectively. You can actually do that as groups of people. And that's like so powerful. And that's kind of what ancient faith practice is about. It's about the fact that together we can resonate something that reflects the best of us. And nowadays, especially if you do watch media and you look at politics or you look at climate or you look at industry, cost of living stuff, very easy to lose hope. And the biggest thing I think my faith, certainly, and those that I increasingly choose to spend my time with. They're really hopeful people.
I think that's brilliant. Shall we?
Yeah, that's, yeah.
Thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Yeah, I picked a good day. I'm in a hopeful place. So funeral.